My name is Tim. I'm on Twitter and most other places at Tim G. Thomas. I am a UI architect with Vectra in Austin, Texas. We're a machine learning and AI-based cybersecurity company. Cognito, representing, is our main product. If you have any questions about that, I'd love to talk to you about it after the talk, or just find me in the hall or something like that. We also have offices in Dublin, so if you're around the area and looking for a place, come talk to me about that too. But today I'm going to talk about symbols, and I apologize in advance. They made the mistake of giving me a laser pointer, so everything's going to be laser pointed today, which also means if you do fall asleep, I can just laser you and wake you up that way. So today we're going to start by taking a look at some history of where icons came from. We'll talk about some specific design considerations that you might want to take into account while you're building them or choosing them. We'll talk about what the web has done to icons, because it's had an extremely profound impact on how we display information of this type. And then at the end, I've got some references if you'd like to learn a little bit more. So to get started, one of the first games that I ever remember playing was back on Windows 3.1. It was, I don't know, 94, 95. I was a little kid. And back in those days, there wasn't a ton of variety in games, and my parents thought that they would help me kind of explore what else was out there, and bought me one of those books with a CD in the back. I don't know if any of you have had one of these. It's like 100 demos of games, basically. And so the idea was that you just pick a day, pick a game, and just play through it for a couple of hours. Most of them were not very good, to be honest with you, but one of them stood out for me and actually ended up really having an impact on my life, believe it or not. And that game was called Castle of the Winds. Has anyone heard of this? Yes. Fantastic, great. So we can enthuse about that later. I love this game. To be honest with you, I still will pull out my DOSBox emulator and play this sometimes. It's a top-down role-playing game. At the time, I really mostly played Dungeons & Dragons, which is pencil and paper. There's not a lot of visuals to it. So this is one of the first role-playing games of the style of D&D that I could actually see. And I could see what my character was doing. They had extreme character customization, such as you could pick male or female. That was it. But then again, a lot of game companies these days don't give you that option, so it was a little bit ahead of its time. But you could see all of this stuff. You weren't just imagining what the monsters looked like. You could actually see them. They would come at you. They would throw daggers at you. You'd see the little daggers move across the screen. Beautifully rendered in pristine 16 colors. It was fantastic. So spent way too much of my childhood playing this game. And a lot of the images that are on here are obviously nothing super special these days. But back then, not only was this an interesting visual challenge to represent what the game designer had in mind, but it was also a technical challenge to get all of these different things to render onto the screen. And it turns out that the developer of this game, which is now, it's not public domain, but it is at least free to download. You still have to have a Windows copy. But one of the things that the developer did was create icons for it. And these weren't just normal icons. These were actually Windows icons. These were embedded inside the exe file in the same way that you might have file icons embedded in the Word executable. So if you opened up an icon tool and extracted these things from the exe, you would see all of the myriad of things that the designer planned for this game. So there's rings, there's cloaks, there's weapons, and it really got me moving on the path of finding out how to concisely represent a lot of these abstract concepts, such as these things are enchanted or they're cursed or something like that, with visual representations. And it turns out I'm not the only one that has sort of had this epiphany over human history, which was a shock to my old 9-year-old self, but today it makes a little bit more sense. This rock was actually discovered, I think it was last September, so this is a fairly recent discovery. This rock is about 73,000 years old, and it's a little hard to see with the projectors, but there's some lines here that we don't really know what they were meant to represent because it's a fraction of a rock. But the fact is, humans took tools, things, and made pictures, or at least some interesting abstract lines that I think I saw in my hotel room last night, that were something that they were thinking of and wanted to save it for posterity. And this happened again 73,000 years ago. Slightly more recently than that, this is 40,000 years ago, was this picture here. And it might be a little bit hard to see on the screens, but we've got this sort of cow, bull-looking wild animal here. And this is the point in history. This, I think, was also discovered late last year as well. So this is one of the oldest, what we call figurative drawings. In other words, this is some squiggly lines. You know, 2-year-old does this now. But this is really one of the earliest mentions of this specific type of drawing in human history. And again, it's this concept of taking something that the people of the time were thinking about constantly. I mean, this would have been a really big, important part of their lives. This is probably either where they got food if they were lucky, or what killed them if they weren't so lucky. And they chose to put this in a semi-permanent medium. Of course, I'm sure they didn't think that 40,000 years later we'd be talking about it sitting on these purple chairs, but that was of utmost importance to them to document this. And we can move even further than this. The most obvious example of icons as a language is Egyptian hieroglyphs. There are still languages these days that use a lot of these pictograms as part of the language. This is probably one of the earliest and best examples. And a lot of these things have sort of become abstract even by the time that this particular wall was chiseled. This language had been around for potentially thousands of years in some form or another. But you can still see things here that are recognizable to us today. There's a laser pointer. I warned you about the laser pointer. There's this little bird here. There's a bird over there. There's some walking feet on that side. So these are things that even now, thousands of years later, we still understand in general what they were trying to communicate. And as history often does, it repeats itself, and now we have a brand new language made up predominantly of symbols. And we use this every day too, or at least many of us do. And to the point where you can usually communicate any general thought, maybe without some of the nuance of our normal language, with pictures. So this is a thing that we as a species have done for a very long time, continue to do, and will probably do even more so in the future. Now, we've seen a lot of this history so far, but how do we sort of tap into this history when we're trying to design our own icons? To start off with, I want to disambiguate some terms. By that I mean make things even more confusing than they might have already been. These are some terms that I may use interchangeably throughout this talk. Icon, glyph, symbol, and pictogram are all basically the same concept. What we're talking about is taking something abstract or even sometimes concrete and providing an image-based representation of it. So this could be, as we saw earlier, some of the rings and cloaks that the little character would put on in Castle of the Winds. It could be some of the birds. Any number of things like that is taking some concept and making it manifest, if you will. I hate to say making it real because we're all here because we're software developers and we don't really know what real is anymore half the time. So most of the time I'll be using these terms interchangeably. There are some nuances between many of them, but just to be prepared for that. One of the things that I like to do to start off with is looking at where icons are in the wild now. So when I'm starting to look for some icon designs for apps I'm working on, I'll look at what's already there and see if I can find some inspiration that way. For one, I'm lazy, and seeing what other people have done is super helpful. But there are also some pretty fantastic ideas out there in the wild. And one of the most obvious, and the one that I usually see first, is navigation. So the upcoming screenshots are from the Apple Shortcuts app on the iPhone. So this is one of the main design paradigms that Apple's apps usually have, and that is a little row of icons at the bottom for navigation. And in this case, they're labeled. You can see library and gallery. And one of the reasons for that we'll get into later is the icons don't necessarily mean a lot by themselves. So having the labels really help here. But there are icons. So once you have understood that there are two sections to this app, once you've used it maybe even twice, you know, hey, there's one icon that looks like 4 boxes. That's going to be one part of the app. There's another icon that looks like a couple of stacked boxes. That's a different part of the app. Another place that icons are super, super helpful at is with categorization. As long as the icons are distinct enough, it's easy to scan across a number of different variants of that icon and see what it is that you're looking for. Again, this screenshot is also from the Shortcuts app. And we've got the 2 boxes at the top relate to music playing. And so we have a musical note on the left side and an icon meant to represent a playlist on the right. And on the bottom are some health-related ones. So we have a drop of water to remind people to hydrate throughout the day, and then a little egg timer for making sure that you brush your teeth on a certain amount of time every day. And so these ways, these icons allow us to categorize these things. I'm not sure I would have picked these icons specifically because I don't think there's a lot of cohesion. Like what does an egg timer have to do with a drop of water? But once you've used them a little bit, you start to recognize these patterns. Even if you're not consciously looking at the patterns, you're subconsciously recognizing that these things might be related to each other. Another great place where we tend to use icons is to represent status. So in this case, I'm looking at one of the specific shortcuts that I've made in this app. If you're not familiar with the app, it's a way to kind of automate your phone to do things for you. In this case, I want to calculate tips, because that's a huge thing in the States. So when I come through here, I'm setting up all of these different options, and as I make changes, I might have made a mistake at some point. So we have the ubiquitous undo action up here in the top left. Now the fact that this icon is bold, it's enabled, it's got a very strong color, you can easily see it, implies that I have made some changes to it. As opposed to next to it, which might not even, I haven't looked at the screens back there, but you can barely see it up here on this screen, probably even less so back there, is the redo icon next to it. So if you're unfamiliar with this flow, you tap undo and then it will give you a step to redo if you accidentally undid the thing you accidentally did to begin with. That icon is grayed out. The status of this panel is that it is not in a state where you can redo something that you were doing before. So we've represented a status with some icons. And then finally is a concept called affordance. In user experience, affordance is the apparentness of a thing to be manipulated. As an example, this clicker has buttons on it. These have great affordance, as we would call them. They are a different texture than the rest of the remote. There's all kinds of symbols on them, icons everywhere. And it's very obvious that you can do something with these. In the same way that the door panels on the door over there, they're silver. They're very obvious that there's something different about that part of the door handle in the back, that is different from the rest of the door. So call it out. Maybe there's something you can do here. So in this example, we've got a couple of different great uses of affordance. The most obvious are these negative buttons on the left, which if you've used any kind of mobile device, you're probably familiar with. Those will remove these records. The one that's a little less obvious, and again with the TVs you might not be able to see, are these little grab handles on the right, which you can use to reorder these items. Both of these could be represented in text, but think about if you had to put the word remove to the left of each one of these items, and then maybe say tap here and drag to reorder on the right. Very, very wordy, not really going to do your users any favors while they're trying to reorganize some of these things. So these are four of the main ways that I've found that we have icons in your normal app use. Obviously, there are a lot of other examples of them. I didn't even have a slide for clickers because I didn't know I'd had one until laser pointer. But everything here, all over the place. Actually, one of my favorite things about visiting Europe is because there's so many different languages, there are icons everywhere because you can't necessarily make any assumptions about the people that are going to be experiencing your icons. Speaking of that, let's see some of the situations where icons actually work really well. And the first one, language barriers. So this is the Facebook app, and at the bottom we've got 3 icons here. Now, this icon, don't get me started on the hamburger menu icons. This is one of those, if you want to find me afterward, I'd be happy to pontificate about it for an hour or so. But ignoring that one, we've got a couple of other icons here. I want to focus on the one in the middle, this bell. Now this bell represents notifications. It's fairly ubiquitous. Almost any app that has some sort of notification to it will probably use the bell. And this harkens back to the days when we had town criers, as I think the last time that they were sort of really in vogue was the early 20th century. But these are people who, when most of the populace couldn't read or write, they would stand outside ringing a bell to say, hey, there's some news, and come listen to that news. There's evidence that town criers existed all the way back in Roman times, though of course bells weren't quite as popular back then. And so this is a symbol that's been ingrained in our history as humans for a very long time. Not 70,000 years long, but a long time. So by using this icon here, it's ubiquitous enough that most users will simply understand it without having to have a label underneath. And this is perfect, again, as I mentioned earlier, in places where you don't know what language your user is going to speak. Or one of the biggest challenges I've had in software is translating an app to German, where normal words that might take up that much space suddenly have a great deal of text that you have to represent. And so being able to choose icons instead of custom words really, really helps. Not only is it better for people of languages you're not expecting that might be using your application. Maybe they don't understand English or German, and so you don't have to translate that. It's also cheaper to not have to translate everything into a bunch of different languages too. Another place where icons can really help is with space constraints. So this is the mobile Safari app, and there are a lot of different types of things that you would need to do at a given time in this app. Now, Apple has decided that these are the things that are most important for users to do. Move back, forward, share. This one's your bookmarks, and this one is looking at the different windows you might have open. I'm not sure I completely agree that all of these things warrant existence on the bottom bar, but the fact is they are there. And again, if we had text that represented all of these things, even if it was just text that's under these icons, not a ton of space there. As a result of this constraint, most of the examples that I'll show today are from mobile apps, just because A, they tend to be ubiquitous enough that language is a concern, and B, they're definitely space constrained. There's not a ton of space on some of these devices. Another example that is not one of the more obvious ones is brand identity. So this is the bottom of the Twitter application. And where most apps would probably have a standard house icon to say go back home, Twitter has decided to be a little bit clever with it, and they have a birdhouse here that represents their brand of the Twitter bird. And I think this is adorable. Like it's a perfect example of using a concept people are familiar with, the house to go home, and putting a little bit of spin on it to make it work with your brand. Again, in this case, the birdhouse here. In other cases, you want to establish an emotional connection with your users. This is the Reddit app, and this is the little Reddit mascot guy. And I turned off my internet and tried to visit the app, and he's certainly had better days. And this really not only reinforces their brand, as we saw in the last slide, but it also shares that frustration with you. Oh, my internet's not working. Well, he's not having a much better day than you are at this point. And so having this icon here really helps connect the user with the application. And then finally, there are cases where you're trying to represent something that's just really, really complex. This is a screenshot from the camera app Halide. I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite apps to use on my phone. I don't really, when I'm traveling like this, there's not much point in carrying a camera, so I have my phone with me. And this is a fantastic app. They didn't pay me to say any of this. I just really happen to like it. And one of the reasons that I like it is it gives me a lot of control over the type of photos that I take. And by doing so, allows me to sort of step outside the bounds of what the normal phone camera apps might afford you. But on the other hand, there are a lot of concepts related to photography that are not easily understood. And some of them are listed here. There's things like ISO, which represents how good your camera works in higher light or lower light. I'm abstracting a lot of these things. Focal length, which is sort of how blurry things closer or distant are from you. And these are super complex topics. They're very mathematically intensive if you've ever studied any kind of photography stuff. And so what the developers of Halide have decided to do is not only just put a bunch of text on the left side, which frankly, if I looked at this screen, I would just skim right over it, and tried to represent some of this stuff with iconography. And not only does this make each of these items a little bit easier to see, let's say that if you switched phones from an older phone to a newer phone, you wouldn't have to necessarily reread each of these line items. You could simply match their icons with what you're already familiar with. But the icons are also used elsewhere in the application. So if you familiarize yourself with these icons here, and then use another part of the application, you might recognize some of the same icons, and it wouldn't require the developer to put a ton of text there. Again, like we saw earlier, let's say if you had to use focal length, if you needed to put the words focal length everywhere, even in English where it's not super long, much less other languages where it might be a lot longer, the little frustum-looking thing there is a lot faster to display on the screen. Now, so far we've talked about reasons you should choose icons, but there are definitely some places where not choosing icons is a better choice for you. The first one is with concepts that your users might not be familiar with. This is an app called Ecobee that I use to control my thermostat at home. And right now, I'm not home. Obviously, to everyone here, my thermostat doesn't necessarily know this. So it has a feature called Smart Away, and there's a little atomic symbol there. I'm not a fan of that icon in this instance. I think there are better ways they could represent this, but that's a talk for another day. What I do want to point out is this concept of Smart Away. So what SmartAway says is not, I am not at home right now. SmartAway really means that none of the motion sensors in my house have triggered, and therefore it has sort of entered this timeout period where it looks like I'm not home, and it's going to either raise my thermostat in the summer when it's hotter or drop it in the winter when it's cooler to use less energy. Super helpful feature, I love it, but occasionally it does trigger if I'm binging a television show on Netflix and I'm just sitting still for a really long time. So they couldn't use an icon that says, I know that you're away from your house, because it's not necessarily true. The other part of this is my cats will sometimes trigger this. So it can't use an icon to say that you're home, because clearly I'm not, even though my cats are and might be triggering the thermostats. So some places here with a concept that users aren't familiar with, maybe at least look into just having some text that backs it up. This is also something very Googleable. It's very difficult, right? It's pretty much impossible to Google for an icon. But if you have a term such as SmartAway, I can Google for that with the name of the app, and then maybe I'll get some documentation that says, here's what that means. There are other places where your app icons might be a little bit off-brand. This is an app called Expensify. I use it for tracking expenses while I'm traveling. And the main thing that it does is replace the physical paper expense reports that you might have had to submit in the past. So obviously there's a really big brand connection between these paper reports and what actually might be submitted to a finance group through paper. So they could have easily used a lot of paper icons, for example, over here on the right where we've got open and reimbursed to say what the status of these things are. But in so doing, that would conflict with the branding within the application. It might look like app icons where really you just have statuses for these things. So again, I'm not sure I would have necessarily gone this direction. I certainly would have picked those colors because I just don't like those colors. But it's a definite point where keep your brand in mind, and if your icons conflict with that, then maybe look at something else. And then lastly, sometimes icons just add a lot of noise. So in this example, this is an app called Dark Sky, which is one of my favorite weather apps. I actually use their API for some side projects as well. And up at the top here, we've got a radar view, and then down at the bottom, we've got an hourly view of what the temperature will look like over time. I think this was last night, hence some of the light rain that was a little bit chilly here. And so there's a lot of visual stuff going on here. Not only do we have the radar at the top, but we've got the bar along the left that represents cloud cover and rain. We've got the temperatures on the right that already use circles to sort of draw the user's attention to them. And then we've got a description in the middle along with the timeline. Now, if we added a lot of icons here, it would certainly be a use of icons. It would make it maybe look a little bit prettier, but it would also detract your attention from all of the other important things about this screen. And since we have this bar on the left, we don't really need the same level of icons. So we could create an icon that represented mostly cloudy, but then we'd have to have an icon that represented partly cloudy, and then overcast, and then sunny. But the bar over here already represents that. The darker the gray, the more the cloud cover. And they've been able to reinforce this through other places of the app. And so adding icons here would not really do anything for usability. It would just cause extra noise. Not to mention, some poor designer would have to go find icons that would work on this side. So once you've decided that icons are a good choice for your application, and this could be the case whether you're picking icons from a separate icon set or if you've decided to use some of your own, there are a few design principles that I'd like to cover today to help you with that process of, again, either picking icons from a set or designing them yourself. First of all, icons should be very simple. This is a grocery delivery app in the States called Instacart, and one of the reasons that I love it is for its iconography. It's very well established with the brand. They did a fantastic job with a lot of that stuff. And so as an example, up here in the top right, you can see we have a shopping cart icon. This is fairly ubiquitous. Again, going back to the language barrier part, almost any society in modern day will have some semblance of a shopping cart that hopefully looks something like that, though they're starting to look a little bit weird in certain stores these days. But it's so simple. There's not a lot of complexity to the design. It's just a few lines and some circles, really. But it so obviously represents the concept of a shopping cart. And the concept of a shopping cart is so obviously relevant to a shopping app for groceries that it makes perfect sense in this context. Next, consistency is very important. So this is an app for a chemist in the US called CVS Pharmacy, and they have a fairly strong brand with these sort of bold lines and angular geometry, and they've represented that in their icons at the bottom of the screen. So all of these icons have the same line weight. You'll notice that none of them visually seem to look heavier than any others. This sort of heart shape here is actually part of their logo, so it helps reinforce that brand there as well. And then they've even represented the heart a little bit over in the stethoscope on the right that represents a way to get to some clinics that they actually have in some of their stores. So all of these things clearly belong to the same family of icons. You could say they were made by the same designer with the same design principles, and hopefully at around the same time. They just all sort of seem like they fit together. And again, some of the main reasons for that is some of the geometry are the same, some of the lines are about the same. So as you're looking through either previous icon sets that have already been designed, or if you're designing some stuff yourself, think of these types of things there. Next, your icon should be fairly unique. This is an example from an Apple WWDC video from, I think it's 2017. It might have been last year's 2018. And they were talking about the news icon. I'll have a link to this video at the end of the talk. And one of the things that they recommend doing is taking a look at your icon in its natural habitat, if you will, and squinting a bit. So if you want to try this now, I won't take pictures of you, so you won't look weird in any photos or anything. But just squint at this a little bit and see which icon stands out. Most likely, it's going to be the news icon, even though it's with a lot of other icons, and it's on a background that's not a single color. Like, it's a fairly complex background as well. And so when they were designing the news icon, they went through a lot of different iterations and ended up with this one because it has that uniqueness to it. Now, my app screen is a complete disaster in comparison to this, so this is definitely sort of ideal conditions. But especially if you're doing an app design, and even if you're doing a normal business app design, take a look at this approach. Do the squint test, see if you can recognize your icon specifically among a sea of other icons. Next icon should be fairly memorable as well. Now, the iOS podcast app, which this screenshot is from, is definitely polarizing. There is a lot of people that are not fans. Honestly, I don't listen to podcasts on my phone, so I haven't had to experience that pain. But I will tell you one of the things that even I recognize is this shape here. So it's a, I don't know, person maybe with some radio transmission lines around it. This is the app icon. It also is shared with this browse feature here. And this is a very, very obvious icon. Even if you've only used the app once or twice, even if you only see it on your home screen once or twice, you can easily identify this icon among others. And so it's super, super memorable. Now, what makes an icon memorable? Again, topic for another day, and is also different for every person. There are a lot of differences in societies and individual communities within those, and even things like whether you're targeting developers versus non-developers. If we made an icon with angle brackets, everybody here would get that instantly. We all understand what angle brackets are. But if you go to another community that doesn't know anything about markup, that icon really wouldn't mean anything. So a lot of this is very, very contextual, especially with the memorability. And then finally, see if you can leverage any kind of families within your application's icons. And what I mean by that are, for example, these icons. This is an app called Untapped. I use it fairly frequently to, as my wife puts it, gamify my alcoholism. But I use it to keep track of what beer I drink throughout the year. And I can say things like, I'm really interested in this beer, so if I happen to be at a place where they sell it, let me know on my phone, and maybe I'll go to a bar and give it a try. And one of the places where I think this app really excels is in its icon families. So we have a few icons here. This is just a normal list of different actions you can take on the home screen. So I can look at beers that are trending, locations near me that are trending, that type of thing. But I can also see top-rated beers and top-rated breweries. And it might be a little hard to see on the screen a bit far away, but both of these icons have an interesting sort of scalloped circle behind it that kind of represents maybe an award or a badge of some kind. And since both of those icons have it, it's clear over time that both of those are related to the same topic. And even though the scalloped appearance doesn't necessarily scream that these are top rated, once you've seen that once or twice, and once you've seen it in icons related to each other once or twice, you really start getting that this represents that these things are award-winning or top-rated or something along those lines. So keep an eye out for this. One of the best examples I can think of here that's not in some sort of mobile app are file icons. Most of the time we still have the little document shape for most of our files on file systems, and then folders for folders. And then within that, there are sub-icons. So either there's like a .doc if it's a Word file, or .docx now, I guess. Or if there's a picture, you're pretty sure it's some sort of image file. All of these things belong to the same family of icons. They have some visual component that's the same. In this case, it's the scalloped award circle. And then other parts of it help specify exactly what that icon is. So at this point, up to this point, we've really spoken in generalities about icons, but the web really had a profound impact on icons and their use. One of the first examples that I ever encountered, actually probably even before the old Castle of the Winds days, were wingdings. Anybody play around with wingdings? Awesome. Even now, there are actually 3 different variants of wingdings on the good old Mac here, as well as another one offshoot called webdings. This was developed in 1990, released with Windows 3.1. Microsoft licensed a couple different symbols from a few different places and released it as one main typeface. And it's got a few dozen just symbols, really. I mean, anything you can imagine. There's phones, there's mailboxes, there's keyboards. They've got some of those really super old trackball mice that you used to have to plug into the side of your computer so that you could use it. I still remember that stuff, that's for sure. So these definitely aren't modern, up to date, but this was one of the first places that I ever saw where you could actually use icons on a day-to-day basis. This was before the advent of web fonts. It was before really the web was as big as it is now, obviously. And so most of the time I would use these on documents to be printed, but still one of the first places where I actually got exposure to icons. Shortly thereafter, as bandwidth increased and we were able to send information that's more than just text, we started using images. This happens to be the emoji of a phone, but it's still basically a raster image, so it's different from like wingdings, which is just a typeface. So this enabled us to have color. Fantastic. I guess we could color wingdings, but just one color at that point. We could have multiple colors, I should say. There's a lot more fidelity here. Tons of detail. There's some nice glint in the top of the receiver there. Of course, as I'm looking at this, I can't tell you the last time I saw a phone that looked like this. I don't know about any of you guys. But this allowed us to really expand what we were doing with icons almost too far. I think people got a little bit crazy with the concept they could use any kinds of images and colors and textures and everything. And we've kind of backed off from that a little bit, but at the time it was like, I can actually send images. This is fantastic. So again, as history tends to do, it repeated itself and we got icon fonts after that. Icon fonts were a fantastic way of delivering scalable graphics, meaning it wasn't pixel-based, so you could make them as large or as small as you wanted, to some of our applications. Fairly low fidelity, though, because as a font, this is just another shape that the font has stored. Much like, honestly, any other typeface is just a series of shapes that we happen to recognize as a language. But these were still one color, unless you wanted to do weird tricks like stacking the icons on top of each other, which I have done a couple of times, but I felt really bad about. And it still lets you represent all of these concepts. What made this possible was two things. One, web fonts, because at that point you could send typefaces to browsers. They would actually render them for you. Pretty fantastic. The other one was some great tooling around being able to generate these things. There's a site, I'll have a link at the end again, called IcoMoon. If you haven't checked it out, awesome site. It allows you to create icon fonts from any kind of vector graphics. So you give it some files, it turns it into a typeface, you tell it what character sets to use, and then it gives you a type file, you reference that in your web app, and then now you've got some icons. But still had its own limitations. For one, again, the fidelity is relatively low. There were also some accessibility concerns here. For one, this is still a typeface, which means you have to have typed characters backing it. And if you had your symbols mapped to common characters, A, B, C, and so forth, screen readers would actually read that for you. And so that's not super fantastic for accessibility reasons. The last thing you want is for your actions to have to be read to you with a bunch of random gibberish at the start. These days, my typical go-to is SVG. SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, is markup-based, XML, some variant of XML. It's all vector, at least most of it is. We'll get to that in a second. And you can define the values within with geometric formula. So scales very well, much like other icon fonts. This is an example from the Noun project of an iPhone. It transmits very well over the internet. There's a lot of really great reasons to use it. One of the things that I'd point you to, and again, this will be available at the end of the talk as well. This is a presentation I did for NDC in Oslo last year, specifically about SVG. So if I haven't scared you off so far with my presentation, this should be easy watching for you. We go into a lot more technical detail on how to create SVGs and some different filter effects and all kinds of cool stuff that way. So let's assume that you've decided on SVG. One thing that I did forget to mention is I mentioned that most of SVG was vector, but it actually can encapsulate any number of other types of files. You can put images in there, you can put typefaces, you can put CSS. And so SVG gives you a lot of strength in that regard. But let's assume that you wanted to go with SVG. What do you do at that point? So there are three main options here. The first is background images. If you've ever done anything with CSS, this should be pretty straightforward. You have a selector, you specify a background image, and you put an SVG there. You can do all kinds of manipulation here. You can change the size, you can change blending modes, you can change rotation, its position. It's a pretty powerful way of referencing SVG, much the same way you'd reference any other image. The downside, though, is that you have zero control over styling these things. And it also, excuse me, has no kind of DOM hooks. So I mentioned SVG is markup. So if you have some sort of library that can animate these things, or at least reference them, none of that is available here. Your browser loads it as a background image and displays it, and that's it. There are definitely cases where this is great, and I still use this approach a lot, but keep that in mind. The other way to do SVG is just right there in your HTML. Just type an SVG tag and go to town. This, unfortunately, adds, depending on the complexity of your SVG, a ton of markup into your DOM, and will probably confuse the hell out of your future self when you try to look at what you're actually trying to display 6 months from now. And then you do a git blame, and you realize it's you, and then it all goes downhill from there. But you can still put all of your SVG right in the DOM. As a result of that, you have complete control over everything. You can style it to your heart's content, you can animate it, any kinds of things like that, because the whole SVG is right here in the DOM. This is actually one of the approaches that D3.js takes. If you haven't looked at that, fantastic, albeit very low-level data visualization library, and it is super great at rendering its SVG to the point where occasionally I'll use D3 to render SVG that has nothing to do with the data visualizations, just so that I can take advantage of its API. And that way you can animate things, you can style them differently, you have complete control. But, again, messes up your DOM quite a bit. The last approach, and the one that we use most often at Vectra, is this use tag right here, right there. This actually references an external file and loads SVG from it and puts it into a shadow DOM. Shadow DOM, again, concept outside of this talk. Maybe next year tell me you want me back and talk about shadow DOM if you want. But this allows you to reference an external file that can be cached by your browser and then load your symbols from that. So at Vectra, we have a process in our build that takes a lot of SVG files that I make and export directly from Adobe Illustrator. Most other tools will export to SVG, design tools. And so I have a huge folder that has all of our icons in it. And so that actually becomes a great reference for our designers. They just navigate through that folder and they see all the icons that are available. But if the browser had to download all of those, that would be a performance nightmare. And so we have a process that merges all of those icons into one SVG file, provides unique identifiers for all of those, which just means there's ID equals icon dash print, for example. And then we use this use directive to grab the files out of there. As a result, again, one file to download can be cached. You have a little more control over styling. Since some of this stuff is put into the shadow DOM, it's not easy to style, but some basic things like fill color, stroke color, all of that stuff you can style fairly easily with this. And it keeps the noise in your DOM down to a minimum. This is really all you need to reference one of those things. The path that's in here can get a little bit long, but at least you don't have potentially hundreds of other DOM attributes for this stuff. I do want to take a moment and specifically call out accessibility on the web. There are a lot of great accessibility talks here this year. I hope you take some time and go attend them because accessibility has really become a big thing recently in terms of we're finally caring about this. Accessibility has always been a thing. It's just we've sort of been able to ignore it in the past. Now we can't. We really need people to be able to use our products and our tools and our applications. So a few things are of particular importance for the use of iconography. One is screen readers. I mentioned earlier that icon fonts still bind themselves to actual letters, usually. So sometimes screen readers will just read the letters to you. So one way that we can get around that with SVG is you provide a title attribute which gets read in place of your icon. So you have an icon there. Screen reader is going to ignore any of the DOM elements inside the SVG that have nothing to do with text, that are just presentational. So if you don't have anything like this title, the screen readers have no idea what it's actually going to say. So research some of this. I've got some links again at the end of the talk for specific ways of doing this. But this is a super quick and dirty way to get at least a little bit of accessibility in. Next is color contrast. And I actually even, as an example of this today, I had to bring up this slide and adjust the transparency so that you could actually see. There is, in fact, an icon over here. I can barely see it from up here. I don't know what those TVs are doing and whether you can see it in the back. But let's say that this was an application where both of these things were relevant icons that needed to be shown. Color contrast represents the color of the foreground, in this case, this icon over here, against its background. This is not unique to icons. All text has this problem, any kind of images, and people with certain types of color blindness, or if they just don't have perfect vision, can have a very difficult time distinguishing shapes from backgrounds. And again, like especially there's a little bit more sun now, so this symbol over here, and again, I promise there is one, really, really hard to see. So keep that in mind as well. And the best way to accomplish this is do some testing on your devices. Many phones have different levels of black, especially with some of the OLED screens, so it can be very difficult to get that balance right. When in doubt, always give more contrast than you think you'll need. There are some fantastic contrast tools online as well. The other great way to resolve this is, or to test for this, is also the squint test, which I promise is not another reason that I can get all of you to squint at me for some reason. But if you do that as well, and I'm just sort of doing it up here, I can't see the left icon at all. So just do a little bit of that squint test, and you will see how hard it is for someone that might even, yeah, even if you do have good vision, sometimes it's really hard to see that one. Be concerned with the similarity of your icons too. This is the counterpoint to consistency and icon families. Both of these icons look very, very similar, but there's some important details in the middle, for example. In this case, just making up some examples, maybe the left one is a normal web browser. The one on the right might mean that your web browser's been installed. I don't know, could mean anything, but they're so similar that, again, squint test is a good one here. I'm a little too close, but if you're a little further back, it's harder and harder to see the difference between these two. So make sure that even if your icons, and especially if your icons belong to kind of the same families, make sure that they are unique enough that you will be able to tell the difference at many different sizes and colors and so forth. And lastly, are pixel ratios. And this is one that has really become important recently because so many of our devices no longer represent one pixel as one pixel. This is a Retina Mac, which means that for every 1 pixel that I define in code, it actually uses 4 pixels, a 2x2 grid, to represent that on the screen. My phone is a 3x device, so for every 1 pixel, it uses 9 pixels, a 3x3 grid. What this means is that the browser or app or what have you has to do a lot more work to figure out where those pixels should align. Believe it or not, both of these symbols on the right are the same icon, exactly the same icon. The only difference is on the left, I've shown it on a 2x screen. So again, every 1 pixel uses 4 pixels to get rendered. And on the right is a 1x screen. Now, if a device can't figure out how to render things that match up with pixel boundaries exactly, it'll try to average it out. There are processes called anti-aliasing, resize, blending modes, and as a result of that, well, you get stuff like on the right. Again, these are the same symbols, but the problem is that the symbol on the left is between the pixel boundaries. So it actually starts at something like 1.5 pixels, and it's 1 pixel wide or tall. So when a screen that doesn't know about half pixels tries to render it, it's completely unusable. The best thing you can do here is test on different devices. A lot of laptops that do have more than a 1x pixel ratio will let you change the resolution down to a 1x so that you can test it that way. You can also plug in external monitors that have a 1x, but keep this in mind, especially if you're targeting mobile devices. Those things are all over the place. I actually keep track of pixel ratios for visits to my blog, and I get pixel ratios like 1.2, 2.7, so it's not even necessarily whole numbers. At some point, I just gave up, and I'm only working on whole numbers there, but it's definitely something worth checking out and worth researching. So far today, we've looked at a history of where icons and iconography came from. We took a couple of stabs at figuring out how to design for icons and what representations make the most sense. We've looked at how the web actually interacts with these things and what changes we need to make there. Lastly, if you'd like, these slides are online at NDC London-icons. Yes, this is the slide I keep referring to. Say, hold on, keep your phones. This is that one. The top link here on Vimeo is my talk last year at NDC Oslo on SVG. CSS Tricks has a fantastic article on making accessible SVGs. I mentioned IcoMoon, especially if you're looking for icon sets. They have some fantastic ones there. Apple's human interface guidelines are pretty fantastic as well. They cover a lot of the same topics that I've covered here with a little more of a technical slant. Even if you're not building iOS apps, they still have some relevance for web apps. The third link from the bottom is Castle of the Winds on Wikipedia. So the two of you that have already played it, you can go there and check it out. And if you haven't played it, I do encourage you to do so. It is a lot of fun. And if you'd like to learn more about the two articles or the two discoveries on some of the ancient drawings and icons, there's some links to nature.com. I will warn you, those are behind a paywall, but at least the summaries are also pretty interesting. So I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming to not fall asleep here after lunch. If you have any questions, I think we still have about 10 minutes or so. If anything comes up after the talk or later in the conference and you don't see me, feel free to tweet at me at Tim G. Thomas. Thank you for your time. So what questions can I answer? And we do have a microphone if you're worried about yelling. Yes, you first if you don't mind. Hold on just 1 second. We'll get the microphone over to you.
Hi there. What's your personal opinion on the new Slack icon and their justification for changing it?
I'm not sure I can, safe for work, discuss my opinion on the new Slack icon. I really like the old icon. I think it's super relevant to what it was doing. I appreciate the need for changing that they've discussed in their blog post. I'm not sure I completely agree with it. I think it was already pretty iconic, so it kind of seems like change for change's sake. In terms of specifics, frankly, it looks like a medical thing to me. Like I can only ever see sort of the Blue Cross looking thing, but that's just personal opinion. I mean, clearly they ran it through a lot of different designers. What's your opinion of it? Do you like it?
I don't know. I haven't really got an opinion on it. I do feel like it seemed like consistently and correctly, and I don't see them as kind of a physical media company, so I don't know why that was particularly important.
Sure. To summarize for the recording, a lot of the justifications were for print media, and they're not really a print media company. I definitely get that. I think one of the things that they, if memory serves, one of the things they called out was how inconsistently the icon was represented. And I feel like that could have been solved with different designs of the same icon instead of redesigning it. But yeah, I have to confess my team doesn't use Slack, so it doesn't bother me as much as maybe it would. Yeah, it certainly has also been polarizing. I think there have been a lot of different opinions there. You had a question, and if you don't mind, he's grabbing the microphone. Oh, sorry. Maybe we'll do that one and then come back up here. Nope, go for it.
Oh, okay. Do you think the floppy disk as the save icon will ever die?
Was that your question? Yeah. Do I think it'll ever die? No. I think that as long as we have the concept of saving to some media, I think we will use that. But having said that, I think the concept of having to save will die. And I think at that point, it will just melt into obscurity regardless. For example, I never once hit save on my slides, because when I make changes, it automatically saves, it's automatically backed up to the cloud, and I think more and more that's what we will see. So I don't even know, I mean, I could easily see us getting back to, we're basically all dumb terminals that SSH into some client thing on Linode or something like that. So I feel like it's never gonna go away as long as we have the concept of saving, but eventually, again, I think the concept of saving will go away. Great question, though. Both of you, great question. Other questions? One in the back? Was that all you wanted to ask? Okay.
Hi, do you think as icons get more complex that Google will eventually do like an icon search rather than the word search?
Oh, so let me clarify by saying there is an image search now. And you can upload an image and it will try to load similar images. I've only had sort of relevant results that way. I definitely can see the concept of searching for some of these things. I don't know if they will or not. I mean, I can't really guess what Google would do. I think it would be helpful. I think especially with the more ubiquity we get with some of these removals of languages, meaning we're a more global society, we need to design things for fewer written languages and more of this iconography. I do hope that they that they will let you do that at some point. I'm kind of getting stuck on the technical implementations. I don't know how you'd be able to represent an icon to them. Going back to games, there was a game, I'm a huge Myst fan, and one of the games in the Myst series had a slate tablet, and you actually had to take your mouse and draw things on it. And they said it took them forever to actually figure out all the logic to get that working. With machine learning and stuff now, I think it's going to be a lot easier, but still the problem is going to be, how do I get the information into the search engine? Once that is solved, and the whole of Google is probably a little bit smarter than just me, but I think that they can do it, and I do hope that they do. I would love to be able to search specifically based on icons. If for no other reason, then I would search for things like the hamburger menu to say, oh, this is already in use as the drag icon, and not use it. Does that answer your question? Other questions? Yes, up here in the front.
Due to the subjectivity of icons, do you think there's an argument for user testing of if you're developing icons? And regarding subjectivity, one man's award icon is another man's crimped bottle cap.
Definitely true. Which actually, now that you mention that, that makes a lot more sense than that it's an award.
Top.
It's the top of a beer, yeah, okay. So, to answer your question, clearly they're subjective. Like I'm sure that was their actual intent now that you mention it. I've been using that app for years, it just never occurred to me. Again, they didn't have the icons for that long. But I absolutely think user testing is important. The company I work for, again, does network security. Talk about trying to make concrete examples of abstract topics. And even in our case, at the most, we get 80% of our users' understanding. We will always have users that say, this makes no sense. Why did you use this icon? Whereas the other 80% say, oh yeah, that's clearly whatever we meant for it to be. I would, as with a lot of other things that are subjective, look at your audience, make sure that you're testing against the right audience. Yeah, user testing, absolutely important. And everything that we talked about here helps with that too. It's really about the questions that you ask. So give somebody an example of a UI that just has a bunch of icons and ask things like, what your goal is to do thing X, how would you go about doing that? And then see if they pick the right icon, see if they're following your metaphors that you're trying to exhibit. And yeah, thanks for the bottle cap. I was like, I know these things are related. I don't know. That makes a lot more sense. We're mostly cans, I think, in Austin. At least we're starting to get more cans. So.
Yeah, but it's like one man's phone is another man's banana.
Exactly. Well, and even the bottle cap thing, like as we move away from bottles, if we do, which we probably won't, that will become the new save icon. Other questions? All right, unless I'm not seeing anybody, I think that's everything. So again, thank you for your time. If you do have any other questions, I'll be here for a few minutes now. Please feel free to catch me in the hall, follow me on Twitter, and I'll answer what I can. Thank you.